Hello, this is the disembodied voice of Benjamin Kennedy, and we're here watching some old footage of the very first miniature sets that I attempted to put together back in 2010 and 2011, and we'll also be taking a look at some buildings from around 2013, which I was trying to put together for the first Gamyong film, but we'll get to what happened to those later on. So right now we're looking at footage from 2010. These are my first attempts at putting together a miniature set from cardboard boxes. By that point there were already cardboard boxes you could get at Home Depot and the like, the cardboard moving boxes. But those were a little still, they were still a bit expensive. And I knew my dad would have complaints about cluttering up the house and stuff like that. So I just collected whatever boxes we had from parcels getting shipped and groceries and, whatever else I could find to use. I also used some water bottles and Pepsi cans and stuff like that to try to make things like industrial complexes and things like that. And maybe it would have been good if I had managed to finish it. But back then, my dad still had problems with having cardboard, whether they were made to look like buildings or not, laying around, cluttering up a room in the house. So a little after I had gathered all these materials to start putting the set together, he basically told me, you can't do monster costumes and sets at the same time. You have to choose one. So naturally I chose to do the monster costumes, because without the monster, you can't have a monster movie. But I pretty much reneged on that promise fairly shortly afterwards because I just wanted miniature sets. And so I started secretly gathering all these boxes that were coming into the house from things being shipped to the house, and boxes from pieces of furniture that we were getting and stuff like that. And I just hoarded it all and turned it into something as quickly as possible. So for some context, I was doing this when I was around 15 years old. I didn't really have a crafting background. My mom and dad did not come from crafting backgrounds, so nobody in the family really had the brain power to be able to put towards trying to make this all work, or how it would even work. So I was just trying to sort it out from the ground up. You may notice that the video here is in a vertical format, and that's because I was trying to solve the problem of the fact that for how I had my studio room set up at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of space to put the camera back away from the subject. So you ended up, if you left the camera sitting normally, you'd end up with the subject, which in this case is me representing the monster, getting cut off somewhere around the mid-torso in the frame. So to get all of me in the frame with the buildings, I sat the camera vertically, and then as you can see here in post, I flipped the video to be vertical. You may notice that some of the proportions seem a little off in the video, and that's due to having to make the video fit the way I wanted to in the horizontal format after filming it vertically. As for whatever character I'm trying to play here, I can't really remember the exacts of it, but I felt more comfortable acting this stuff out if I had some sort of character in mind. And since I was stuck with just putting myself in front of the camera, I figured, well, why not just the dopiest teenager ever? So I played a big baby tantrum throwing teenager type monster, as you can see from the tantrum I'm throwing on the floor there. You can also see my very primitive green screen in the background. That's the very first green screen I ever had, and I initially filmed many of my stop motion Godzilla fan films in front of that. It never worked as well as it probably should have, but I also never really had any proper filming lighting until I was well ahead of this stage of my life. Back then, we were just using house lamps for lighting. I don't even know if any of us knew there was special lighting for this stuff. But a lot of these things, is trying to test to see how well I could chroma key the backdrop out in post-production, in addition to setting up the sets and how I could potentially do these scenes, make a decent composition, and do some destruction within the limitations of my set. And you can see that I'm just experimenting with various ways of setting up and setting the camera up and stuff like that, in any way I can to be able to do what I want. That green screen was not a proper material, by the way. It was a muslin or canvas type of thing, and so it didn't really reflect light as well as like the green screens you can get from like chromakey.com and stuff these days, which are special material and they reflect light a lot better, and so they chroma a lot better. That was just a plain canvas or muslin backdrop, and it just reflected light horribly. So green screening was very hard back then. So for this shot here, I was basically trying to find any angle in the studio I could to sort of be able to get me and the miniatures in the same shot. And obviously I hated this. It looked horrible. So I didn't end up using anything like that. But I kept trying different angles, kept trying to see which part of the room I should have the camera in and which part of the room the set should be in, to try to just work it out. So now we're getting to be in late 2010, I believe, and I was starting to get a lot more satisfied with how this first set was coming along, because as you can see, I had collected more boxes, I had collected empty water bottles to make like some oil refinery type of things out of them or something. It was starting to look more impressive, and I was pretty happy with how it was coming along. I was able to put together some slightly taller buildings, which would help when filming. Here's one of my old cats playing around the set. Cats always love playing around in box sets. Every time I would set it up, they would want to play around in it. I'm not sure if this is the girl cat I used to have or the boy. It might be the girl. Oh, it's both of them. They're both in there. Okay, I think the one in the background was the boy. And here's the girl. This is what happens when you have cats and you try to make monster movies like this. They always intrude on the shot. I have 2 other cats now, and they're always intruding on my current set and messing it up, and I have to put it together again, and they're always messing up my shots. Oh, actually, this one here is the boy cat. I can tell because he's really skinny. He was a skinny, athletic cat. He was a good cat. But yeah, you can see here that I had worked long and hard to collect a lot of boxes for this, and I was feeling pretty good about myself at the time. So all this footage was filmed before I got an high definition camera, and this was filmed with a Canon ZR930, which filmed on mini DV tapes. It was my first real movie camera, one that was specifically meant to film movies. I filmed most of my earlier movies on this camera. Right now, it looks like I'm experimenting with trying to use flashlights to make electrical flash effects. I think upcoming, there's also a test to see if I can do searchlight type of things, but these right here is me testing to see if I can do electrical flashes and stuff like that. I was trying to get as prepared as possible for when I finally was able to make the actual monster movie. But as it happens, by the time I was doing that, then I had no set because we had moved, and I had to throw everything I had built away before we moved. And even if we had kept it while we were moving, it would have likely been destroyed in the move. So I ended up having to start all over again. And unfortunately, in the process, it's like I just forgot how to do all this. I think it would have been nicer to be able to do stuff like that. Maybe I'll still do it someday. I think I'm about at a state where maybe I can do that. The problem is you need multiple people on the set to do that. And usually I just do stuff alone. So a lot of stuff like that ends up being put in post. But I may try to find a workaround. This shot here I remember well because you can see that I was able to stack boxes higher and all that stuff. It was starting to look a lot more like a city and not just, a few boxes that were laid out here and there. This is another test to see if I made a quadrupedal monster, would it be easier to film? And as it turns out, it was easier to get me in the shot with the buildings, and I didn't have to worry about the ceiling because I was well underneath the green screen. This is a test to see what a a bipedal monster would look like, and what camera angle I would need to use to get that. And that was a very lazy attempt at doing it. I guess I was getting a little self-conscious at the time. You can tell I'm putting minimal effort into actually doing any acting for these shots. I generally found it hard to actually put my full heart into acting when I was focused more on the technical parts of it. So whenever you see stuff like this, it's more like a technician trying to be out on the camera. And this is what happens when I do get over myself. I just act like a goofball. This is another test to see what a quadrupedal monster would look like. What kind of shots I could get with that. And this one I consider to be a better composition. Okay, so now we're getting into set 2.0. This is sometime in 2011, maybe mid to late 2011, because it's in a more completed state than just having a bunch of boxes. You can see that I've got windows placed on some of them and stuff like that, most of them actually. So you can see the progression of where I got compared to the first set. It's starting to get a little more detailed. They're starting to look a little more like maybe actual buildings. They're still definitely not scaled in any sort of appropriate manner, but I was really tired at the time, and I just needed a way to get them done easily. So basically, my way of doing it was, well, mostly a window is just a sheet of regular 8.5 by 11 inch paper. I would place the paper down, and if I felt like splitting it up into smaller windows, I would get some additional cardboard and lay it down to make it look like it was more than one window or one pane. And that's how you see these smaller buildings. They're not actually individually cut windows. They're this one big surface that I put one piece of paper on, and then I split it up with the additional cardboard. In the background is just a flat 2D building that's there purely to be background. So now we've entered the high definition era of my filmmaking. This is, I believe, the day after my birthday, for which I received the high definition camera, and it also marks the start of having actual filming lighting for lighting the scenes. You can notice because of the temperature of the light, it's no longer yellow, it's actually the color of daylight. My dad looked into all this stuff, and he ended up getting me a nice little lighting kit from a place called Cowboy Studios, which I don't know whether or not is still in business. But it was really exciting to have some actual filming light to use, and you can see here that I'm just trying different setups. And at this point you may be wondering about the black trash bags in the background. I put those up because green screens were still very expensive at the time. By this point, my dad had bought me a much better green screen that was a foam green screen. It was much better at what it was supposed to do, but it was rather small lengthwise for what I wanted in terms of getting shots. But because they were so expensive, I decided to take a alternative route, and I made this night background out of black trash bags, and I just used the little pins to pin them to the wall, and I put them all up on two sides of the room. That would make it most convenient for filming, and as you can see, I'm starting to get much nicer, wider shots, which was the whole purpose to it. The disadvantage is that you couldn't do any daytime shots because the trash bags are black, of course, and they're not blue. Maybe I should have looked for some blue trash bags. So now we're getting to a point where he came up with the idea to get this black rubber stuff, which looked kind of like road, from Home Depot, and it was not cheap, but it wasn't expensive. And he got it so I could set up all this road stuff for like dragging little toy cars along and everything like that. And I put it down, and I was really thrilled because it really did give the impression of like a roadway in the city. So it made it that much more atmospheric, like, you know, it's an actual place and not just a bunch of boxes set up. And what you're seeing are the first tests I did with this black roadway. And you can see that I'm just doing whatever I can think of and see what kind of shots I can get. I was really happy with it, you know, because now it's like I had trees. My dad had bought me some tree sets from Home Depot during the Christmas season that I could set up around the set. He bought me the roadway. He got me these little tanks and stuff. He got me little army guys too, which I could set up. I think I still have some of those army guys too. And things were getting really good. I was really looking forward to actually shooting the picture. So I was really excited about this, but unfortunately, as it was getting so good, we ended up having to move states. And so I ended up having to trash this set because we were moving, and it would have taken too much space, and it probably would have gotten destroyed anyway in transit. So I had to start over once we got to the other state. But that was a bit harder for me mentally at that point because I was starting to feel the pressure of having to get more professional and things like that. And so I ended up not ever being satisfied with what I was making. And so I ended up with nothing to shoot set-wise by the time we were ready to do the first Gamyong picture because I was being prudish. So this shot is from when we had settled into the new state. We were in a rental house at that point, and my studio room was basically just an average sized room. In the old house, we had one of those game rooms, and I used that as my studio room, so it was rather large. But in this house, I only had a really average sized room. It was fairly small. So there was only so much space. And as you can see here, I was pretty close to getting the Gamyong costume towards completion. It wasn't until maybe a year after I took this shot that it was completed, but in terms of the body, it's nearly completed here. So in terms of set, I was really limited to just a few pieces, which was okay because at the time I was really kind of busy studying for my GED so I could graduate high school. And I was low on energy. I was quite low on wherewithal to sort of even figure out how to start putting another set together. But basically I started with just cardboard boxes that I had from the move, and I just cut these strips of paper and I put them on the buildings for windows, and that was it. Although, you know, it's so simple, and when you look at them, they're really simple, but it took me a lot of energy to put these things together at that time. I was just really tired at that point. Anyway, you can see here I'm kind of doing a test to see what kind of movement can be done in the Gamyong costume with these buildings and what type of composition I can do. I was originally thinking to make the first Gamyong film a black and white Agon-ish type of movie, a bit more creepy. In this shot you can see all three buildings that I was able to have to work with in this very small studio space at the time. This larger building that the camera is focusing on was going to be a clock tower, but I never had the opportunity to finish it. And I don't remember if it survived the move into our permanent house. So this is the set that I was attempting to build once we got into our permanent residence. Again, these were just moving boxes that I recycled from the move. I was trying to be a bit more elaborate by putting some roofs on some of them and things like that. I can't remember exactly what the reason for not finishing it was. All those boxes went by the wayside, and I ended up starting over again and trying to have maybe 2 or 3 boxes that were buildings, and maybe just have a few on the set and then take pictures of them so I could basically place them around digitally in whatever frame they needed to be in, and make a full set that way. Again, this room was not a large space. It was just a regular sized bedroom that I was making a studio at that point. So it was really cramped. So these are the buildings I mentioned earlier, which were supposed to be, I made 2 of them, and the plan was you'd have 2 buildings on the set, and there would be pictures from every angle that you could then place in post-production and make up a much larger set that way, almost like digital buildings that you can use for like making architectural plans and stuff like that these days, but with real buildings, real miniatures, instead of CG digital buildings. The problem with this period was I was starting to get a bit too self-conscious, and I was thinking, well, they don't look anything like a realistic building, and I felt like, because I was getting on the verge of my 20s at this point, and I was feeling like if I was going to make movies my living or something, then I needed it to be taken seriously. So I kind of abandoned these buildings before they were able to be finished because I felt they were too cartoony and therefore wouldn't be taken seriously. And that's why the original Gamyong ended up being filmed with real places, and I put Gamyong into those real places, which I'm still proud of the fact that I did that and I was able to do it as well as I did. But it just wasn't really the way I wanted to make monster movies. So the ironic thing about rejecting the buildings that I had already kind of constructed for being too cartoony was that in the end we actually needed a few miniature buildings for a few shots in the first Gamyong, and because we didn't really have time before shooting to build the buildings that I would rather have had, we ended up going to Home Depot and buying these, what I believe are duct covers. They have something to do with ducts. And of course, they look nothing like real buildings. If they look anything like anything in real life, it's just under construction buildings. And how many buildings will be under construction at the same time like that? So obviously, when the Gamyong costume fell apart after Gamyong's counterattack, and I knew it would be a while before the next movie, I decided to take the initiative to actually get together a set that actually looked better. Okay, so now we've jumped over to 2015. I started working on this set from 2014. The white building and the little Tory gate that's on the left there, I started on in 2014. My dad got me these Home Depot moving boxes to be able to use, and I just cut windows rather randomly. They're not scaled or anything. I just cut them to a size that I thought looked good for them. And I cut them out with an X-Acto blade. And when I would cut the first window out, I would use the piece that would be cut out from the box as a template, and I just used that to draw all the other windows on there. So in the end, I initially started with about 3 buildings, as you can see, and this is when I started really getting into trying to build a world with the miniatures, and trying to have some more details from reality, but with interpretation, because that made it easier to build from cardboard and things like that. So I added things like street signs and no pedestrian signs and roadways and things like that. I had started getting really into that because I saw a documentary that the NHK made in Japan on tokusatsu, and in the documentary they went to Marbling Fine Arts, which is a company that makes miniatures for pretty much all the major monster franchises that came out of Japan, at least at the time. And I was really inspired by that to like try to create an actual world with the miniatures and not just have the buildings. To sort of be able to, one reason was to increase the story possibilities that I would be able to have too, because I'm not a big fan of location shootings. I don't like being out and about all the time. I don't like driving to places, and I don't like being out in the weather too much. So I felt an increased potential story possibilities as well, because then I would just be able to say, oh, this scene should take place here, and if I need an exterior, I could just set up a miniature shot, and then you have the location you need. So now we've moved locations. The previous room you saw was actually my bedroom. I started constructing all this stuff in my bedroom in our permanent residence, and now we're seeing what became my actual studio in the house after a certain point. Sometime in early 2015, my parents decided that they would convert our front room into a studio for me, and that's literally like the front room of the house. So when you come in the door, and if you turn to the right, that's the room that you would immediately see it. So essentially, they just let me clutter up the front of the house with all this junk. So, but that gave me a lot more space to work with. So I was able to do a lot more. I was able to experiment a lot more with making miniatures and how many miniatures I wanted, and also with having enough space so that way the ceiling was not a problem. This was the only studio I've had in which the ceiling did not become a problem, because those ceilings were quite high, and so all I needed was this blue screen here, which you can see. My dad was responsible for setting this up. He found some track that you can hang a curtain up on with wheels that have clips on them, and the clips connect to the blue screen. And so the blue screen you could expand as far as you wanted, and you could leave certain parts still folded in, as you can see here. So I was able to have both of these walls covered, and actually my dad set it up so I could basically have the entire area covered with the blue screen if I wanted to. We're getting into later 2015 here, and you can see that I've been building my most extreme costume to that point, which was totally constructed out of 2-inch foam basically, and I sculpted it down with a bread knife and all that stuff. I was making latex scales for it, and it was a good opportunity to see how I could set up the buildings and everything like that, and around the monster, and be able to create the world I wanted around the monster, and have everything sort of come into view, have the monster completely in the camera, and have what details I wanted from the set in the camera. My mom also helped me on this particular set by painting mountains that you can see in the background sometimes for me, as well as Mod Podging some of the buildings so that they'd be easier to paint. And at this point, I was creating a replica of the Tokyo Capitol building, but I assembled all this stuff in a way where you could, it was very modular, so that way you could separate buildings, you could put different sections on different buildings to create different types of buildings, so that way, even though you had a limited amount of actual cardboard buildings available to you, you can mix and match them kind of like Legos, so that way they created different buildings in order to create different areas and have some variety. This was a test to see if we could do some effects with the earth swallowing the buildings. And these are some tests to see what the buildings would look like outdoors. It's usually a good way to see if you can create some sort of convincing illusion with whatever it is you've constructed. I was actually pretty pleased with these shots at the time because it does give an impression that they exist. Okay, so now we're up to 2017, and basically, nothing too much changed. I was just adding on to the set and taking some buildings away or adding some buildings depending on what was working and what wasn't. I was trying different techniques to try and get the buildings done quicker and more efficiently. As you can see with this yellow building on the left here, which has only paper windows. Now we're at a point where we've changed residences once again, and at this point, this is the studio that I'm still in. But basically, we moved house to a house that has a lower level, and I'm on the lower level, so I'm completely out of sight now. And so I was able to construct all this stuff and be able to leave it set up and stuff without having to worry about people coming into it, because it's just my space and nobody can really see it unless they want to come in. But basically what happened with the set stuff once we moved in was that I needed to be able to collapse the buildings to a certain extent and be able to put them somewhere when I wasn't filming, because in the meantime I needed space to be able to construct the costume which you're seeing here, because this room served as every creative space. It was my costume construction space, it was the set space, it was the filming space. So I needed to be able to have set materials that would be able to fold down and be able to be put away very efficiently. So what happened was I basically trashed all of the previous set from the previous house, and I started over again with moving boxes which we had used to move from the previous house into this house. And I stayed up late one night and I went to the garage and I got a lot of boxes, as many as I would need to complete an actual set. And then I just focused on getting them done very quickly. The previous set had taken me several years to get into a state of semi-completion. So with this one, I was really just looking for a way to very quickly get these buildings done. So instead of attempting to make them look complex on any level, I just went with these cartoon type of windows, and I made the size so that way they're big enough to not need to cut out so many windows per building, but they're also small enough to look aesthetically pleasing. And when it came to these buildings, I only cut windows out on one or two sides per building, because it saved time, it saved hassle, and in the end, most of the setups that I was doing, you didn't really need windows on all sides. That's something you can do just to add more realism, but it wasn't really necessary to make them look like buildings. All you needed was the front side, so that's what I did. I just cut out the front side windows, and that was it. And that saved me a lot of time and energy, and I managed to get these things done maybe in a month or so, once I set my mind to it, as opposed to for the previous sets, it was like taking me several years sometimes. Some of these buildings were still leftovers from the previous set, like the little red buildings back there, and that's because they were small enough to stack up without taking a lot of room. So you can probably tell that, because now we're up to 2020 or 2021, I believe, and you can tell that I've added windows to certain buildings. I've added aging effects to a lot of the buildings. Basically, I was just trying to improve and iterate on the set I had already created. All these buildings you can see in the third Gamyong movie. But basically, I was just trying to improve what I had. This is later on in 2021, and my mom convinced me that I needed to have buildings that were a bit more realistic, so to speak. So it just so happened, just like a lot of people in the world at that time, we were getting a lot of online shipments, so I had enough boxes to start over again. And so that's what I did. I threw the previous things out and I started over again. And I aimed to make it as realistic as possible. So for these, when I cut out the windows or started drawing the windows on the boxes, I actually looked up actual window sizes, and then I got a scale calculator, and I used that to scale the actual size of the windows down to the 1/24th scale. Honestly, it wasn't the most fun process, and it took a long time to make each building, and I was proud of it, but it wasn't exactly fun, and it took too long to make each building, I thought. My mom was supposed to paint them initially, but she ended up being very busy, and because when I calculated trying to make them look like real buildings in terms of getting paint and doing it, it would have cost a tremendous amount of money. So basically I just went with more vibrant, cartoony colors again, and that made it a lot simpler. Aging was not a problem with these buildings because I just applied one coat of paint to all the buildings, and I was using acrylic paint instead of like the latex house paint. So it created this natural sort of aged look because the paint looks different in different transparencies in different areas of the box. So instead of having to add the aging was already kind of built in. All I had to do was just not paint over it again. I also took pains to cut out all the windows and have a hollow inside because I wanted to hook up lights into the buildings and actually be able to light them up for night scenes, which I was able to do with these first batch of buildings, but it turns out that it makes the boxes rather fragile, and over time they just kept getting more and more fragile. So that ended up not being the most viable idea for having long-term buildings. So we're getting further into 2021, and at this point I decided that I wanted as much stuff in the movies I made to be as real as possible, because I really always enjoyed the craft aspect of these movies, and it's kind of unfortunate because it's mostly lost now. So I took the bother to make these mountains that are 2D. They're all 2D, so that way I can fit them inside my studio when I need to store them. And I just cut them out, and so you can place them around the set in order to either have mountains in the background, or you can have hills in the foreground, or you can just create this hilly landscape as you can see here. It works out very well because Gamyong is a volcano monster, so you can also create a volcano type environment too. But it also works for like creating a Monster Island or just nice hilly landscapes. Of course, I made them to look like desert mountains because I live in the desert. So it's just like adding an element of my reality to the monster reality. You may also be noticing that a lot of the time there are now these telephone poles, and sometimes there are street lights in the frames, and that's because I constructed all of this stuff because again, I wanted a more realized world, so that way people could sort of put themselves into the action a bit more, and also to have a bit more atmosphere. And again, because actually buying these things would be quite expensive for the amount of objects I needed on the set, I just constructed them out of paper. The telephone poles are made out of regular letter-sized paper, and they're just rolled up as tightly as I could possibly get them. And the two horizontal things that are sticking off of them are just little pieces of cardboard that I then glued onto them. The lamps are, I believe, maybe legal-sized paper. And just like the telephone poles, I just rolled up the paper, and then I bent them over at a certain point in their height, so that way they would have this leaning part to them, and the actual lamp part of it is a piece of cardboard. Of course, they don't really stand up by themselves once they're done, so you have to have bases of some sort for them to be able to sit in, so they're stabilized. In this case, my mom, she gets these little cardboard boxes from her art supplies. They're just these little square or rectangular boxes, and I just cut round holes into them so that way I can insert the telephone poles or the light stands into them, and they work rather well for their purpose. So this stuff that you're seeing now is actually footage for a potential movie that I was trying to put together in 2021. And obviously that didn't really come to be, but this allows you to see how all of this stuff comes together. So when you start putting all these things together, like the telephone poles and the street lamps and the buildings and signs and everything like that, you start getting a much more realized and interesting world around the monster. So in turn, it kind of makes the monster a little more interesting because now you can kind of relate to the surroundings a bit more. So now we're getting into the final stretch. This is 2022 to 2023, and basically very little has changed other than the fact that I got two of these blue screen mats. They're called dance floors from Roscoe, but one side is chroma blue and the other is chroma green. And I got those to cover the floor so that way I can put basically any type of ground terrain that I want to into the set into post. and I think that's a worthwhile investment. As you can see, there's a few new buildings. These pinkish magenta buildings are new, and I constructed them to replace some buildings that I had before. As you know, as I was stating, that were getting flimsy, so I threw those out and replaced them with these new buildings, which use paper windows that I made templates for. Again, they're actually scaled down from the scale of actual windows in real life, but I made templates for them, and so then I could copy them and print them out from a printer, so that way all I have to do is cut them out and then place them one by one onto the box after it's been painted. And I like that process more. It's a bit quicker, it's easier, and it's less headache. So overall, I'm pretty satisfied with where this particular set is. I still work on various add-ons here and there whenever I feel like it for fun. But in terms of when I start filming again, I'm pretty satisfied with all the things that I've built and accumulated and what I can make out of it. It's been helpful to be able to look at all this put together too, for me personally, because now I can see that there has been quite a lot of improvement in the past 13 years, and that's very encouraging. And it's also very nice to see where you can come without having a big background in doing this type of arts and crafts, and you can actually get to a point where you can create something that's satisfactory to yourself, if not to other people. But I'm pretty happy with this, and hopefully I'll feel like continuing it into the future. It's an activity that I like to do, and we'll see how it develops from here on out.